The dust tasted of endings. Ilara, no more than 7 summers etched onto her small frame, watched the wagon dwindle, a shrinking rectangle of betrayal against the vast, indifferent canvas of the plains. Her mother's hand, a fleeting pressure on her shoulder, was already a ghost memory, lost to the rumble of wheels and the plume of ochre that rose like a dismissive sigh. She'd been told to wait. Told someone would come. But the sun climbed, a merciless eye in the bleached sky, and the silence that pressed in was heavier than any stone. She clutched a bundle wrapped in faded calico, its contents a mystery her trembling fingers dared not explore. Each gust of wind whispered desolation, stripping away the thin veneer of hope her mother's hurried words had tried to weave. The trail was a scar on the land, empty in both directions, and she, a tiny, forgotten stitch in its ragged seam. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her, not the wild panic of a startled animal, but the slow, creeping dread of utter aloneness. Her throat was tight, a knot of unshed tears and unspoken questions. Why? The word was a silent scream in the hollow of her chest. She curled into herself, a small, dark shape against the pale earth, the sun beginning its westward arc, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, colors too beautiful for such a bitter day. The shadows lengthened, turning familiar sagebrush into grotesque figures, and the night sounds began, the chirp of crickets, the distant yowl of a coyote, each one a fresh assault on her frayed nerves. She was a splinter, cast off and insignificant, in a world that had simply moved on without her. Silas Blackwood knew the language of hardship better than he knew any prayer. His ranch, a stubborn patch of earth clinging to the edge of nowhere, was a testament to a life lived on the lean side of fortune. His days were measured in sweat and silence, the sun his clock, the ache in his bones his almanac. He was returning from a fruitless trip to the dry creek bed, hope for water dwindling with the season, when he saw it, a smudge against the fading light, too small for a lost calf, too still for a predator. His horse, old Bess, snorted, her ears privating. Silas, hand instinctively going to the worn stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard, approached with the caution of a man who'd learned that surprises on the trail were rarely good. Then he saw her. A child. Curled up like a field mouse hiding from a hawk. His heart, a shriveled thing he rarely acknowledged, gave a jolt that was almost painful. He dismounted, his movement slow, deliberate. Child? His voice was rough, raspy from disuse. She didn't move, didn't flinch. He knelt, the dust puffing around his worn boots. Her face was smudged with dirt and tears, her eyes closed, but her breathing was shallow, regular. A bundle lay beside her. Abandoned. The word settled in his gut like a stone. He'd seen it before, families too poor, too desperate, making impossible choices. He himself was a breath away from that kind of desperation most days. He looked around, as if expecting an explanation from the empty landscape. There was none. Just the wind, whispering its bleak secrets. He couldn't leave her. The thought was as solid and unyielding as the baked earth beneath his knees. It wasn't kindness, not as he understood it. It was necessity. The kind that drove a man to pull a lamb from a snowdrift or mend a broken fence in a blizzard. She was a life, flickering, and he was there. He gently scooped her up. She was light, too light, a bundle of twigs and faded cotton. She didn't stir, her small body limp in his arms. Well, now, he muttered to the indifferent sky, what am I to do with you? The shack was little more than 4 walls and a roof, a bulwark against the worst of the elements but offering few comforts. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and the faint, persistent scent of Silas's solitude. For Ilara, waking to these unfamiliar smells, to the sight of a rough-hewn ceiling instead of the open sky, was a fresh wave of terror. She lay on a narrow cot, a coarse blanket tucked around her, and watched the man. He moved with a quiet economy, stoking the small fire in the hearth, his shadow large and dancing on the walls. He wasn't like the men from the wagon train, loud and boisterous. He was silence itself, a presence as weathered as the landscape outside. He didn't try to talk to her, for which she was grateful. Words were barbs, reminders. He placed a chip bowl of watery stew and a hunk of dry bread on a small crate near her cot. Eat, he said, not looking at her directly. His voice was low, gravelly, like stones shifting in a riverbed. Elara stared at the food. Hunger gnawed at her, a dull ache, but fear was a tighter knot. She didn't move. He didn't press, just went about his own meal, equally meager. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the clink of his spoon against his bowl. Days bled into one another, marked by the son's journey and the man's quiet routines. He would leave at dawn, return at dusk, his face etched with the day's toil. He always left food for her. She ate when he was gone, small, furtive bites, like a wild thing. Her bundle remained untouched, a silent testament to a life she was too afraid to unpack. She spoke to no one, not even to herself. The words had dried up, lost somewhere on that dusty trail. Her world had shrunk to the confines of the small cabin, the dusty patch of yard she could see through the single grimy window, and the looming presence of the silent man who had, for reasons she couldn't fathom, taken her in. His poverty was stark, she saw it in the patched knees of his trousers, the thinness of the stew, the way he mended his tools with meticulous care, as if they were precious jewels. There was no room for waste, no space for softness. It was a hard life, and she was now a part of its unyielding rhythm. Slowly, cautiously, Elara began to watch Silas, not with fear, but with a dawning curiosity. She learned the cadence of his movements, the set of his jaw when the day had been particularly harsh, the rare occasions when a line around his eyes would soften, though never quite reaching a smile. She saw him coaxing life from the parched soil in a small garden patch, his calloused hands gentle with the struggling seedlings. He mended fences with a grim determination, his silhouette stark against the dawn sky as he rode out, and again, weary, against the bruised twilight as he returned. He never asked anything of her. He simply existed, a constant, steady presence in the tumultuous landscape of her young life. One morning, she found a small, intricately carved wooden bird on the crate beside her breakfast. It was crudely made, the knife marks still visible, but the lines of it were surprisingly graceful. She picked it up, its smooth, cool surface a comfort in her palm. She didn't know what to make of it. A gift? An offering? She said nothing, but she kept the bird clutched in her hand, hidden in the folds of her dress. Another day, she watched him struggle to thread a needle, his large fingers clumsy with the delicate task of mending a tear in his shirt. His brow was furrowed in concentration, a low grunt of frustration escaping him. Hesitantly, almost without thinking, Elara reached out. Her small, nimble fingers took the needle and thread. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the task. The thread slipped through the eye of the needle on the first try. She stitched the tear with neat, small stitches, a skill her mother had insisted upon. When she was done, she laid the shirt on the table and retreated to her cot, her heart hammering. She didn't dare look at his face. She heard him pick up the shirt. The silence stretched, taut and heavy. Then, "Good work," just 2 words, spoken so softly she almost missed them. But they landed in her like seeds, tiny and fragile, but holding the promise of something new. It wasn't praise, not exactly. It was acknowledgement. And for Elara, who had felt invisible for so long, it was everything. Silas felt the weight of the child's presence more keenly than he would ever admit. She was a ghost in his small cabin, a silent reproach to his solitary existence. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't wanted it. His life was pared down to the bone, every ounce of energy focused on survival. A child was a complication, a responsibility he felt ill-equipped to handle. He remembered another child, a laugh that no longer echoed, small hands that no longer reached for his. The memory was a raw wound, one he'd tried to cauterize with years of silence and hard labor. Elara, with her wide, haunted eyes, picked at the scab. He knew what they'd say in the settlement, the few souls clustered around Miller's store and the dusty saloon. Blackwood's got himself astray. Wonder how long before he tires of it. They already thought him odd, a man who preferred his own company, who wrestled a living from land most considered cursed. He saw the flicker of curiosity, of suspicion, in Jed Miller's eyes when he traded a few painstakingly trapped pelts for flour and beans. "Heard you got company," Miller had said, his voice carefully neutral. Silas had just nodded, his gaze flat. Found her on the trail. No more explanation offered, none asked for, but the questions hung in the air. He worried about the coming winter. His stores were meager. Another mouth to feed, it was a daunting prospect. Yet, when he saw her, small and watchful, clutching that little wooden bird he'd whittled without conscious thought, something in him shifted. It wasn't affection, not yet. It was a stubborn refusal to let another life be extinguished by indifference. He'd been left once, in his own way. He wouldn't do that to her. He tried to teach her, in his own rough way. Pointed out which berries were safe, how to read the signs of weather in the clouds, the way to bank the fire so it wouldn't die in the night. He didn't expect responses, and he rarely got them. But he saw her watching, absorbing. Her silence was a wall, but sometimes, he thought he saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. It was a slow, arduous process, this forging of an unwilling bond. He was learning patience he didn't know he possessed, a tenderness he thought had died long ago. The small acts of connection, fragile as desert blooms, began to take root. Ilara started leaving her cot earlier, tidying the small cabin in her own quiet way before Silas rose. She swept the packed earth floor with a makeshift broom of twigs, arranged his few chipped mugs neatly on the rough shelf. She still didn't speak, but her actions were a language of their own. One afternoon, while Silas was out mending a distant stretch of fence, a shadow fell across the doorway. Ilara froze. A man stood there, tall and broad, with eyes like chips of cold blue ice. He wasn't from the sparse settlement, he had the arrogant bearing of wealth and power. "Blackwood Inn," he drawled, his gaze sweeping dismissively over Ilara, then around the meager interior of the cabin. Ilara shook her head, shrinking back. "Tell him Henderson was here. About the South Spring." "He knows what I mean." The man's lip curled slightly as he looked at her again, a flicker of something calculating in his eyes. "You his kin?" Ilara remained silent, her heart pounding like a trapped bird. Henderson chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Thought not." He turned and left, his boots heavy on the dry earth. When Silas returned, Ilara was visibly distressed. She couldn't form the words, but her fear was palpable. Silas saw the fresh tracks near the cabin. "Someone here?" he asked, his voice sharp. Ilara nodded, pointing towards the south, her eyes wide. "Henderson," Silas muttered, his face darkening. He looked at Ilara, at the fear still clinging to her. He placed a calloused hand briefly on her shoulder. "He won't bother you," the words were a vow. A few days later, on a rare trip to Miller's store for salt and lamp oil, Henderson was there, holding court with a couple of listless townsfolk. He saw Silas and Ilara, who clung to Silas's leg, half hidden. "Well, Blackwood," Henderson said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "Still playing nursemaid to strays? That spring on my southern parcel, it's drying up. Funny, since your patch sits just above it. Some say you've dammed it." Silas met his gaze, his own steady. "My water is my water," Henderson claimed fair and square. "We'll see about that," Henderson sneered. A man barely scraping by, harboring a child not his own, folks might start asking questions. Official questions. Ilara felt Silas's hand tense on her shoulder. She looked up at him, then at Henderson, at the smirking faces of the onlookers. A tiny spark, fierce and protective, ignited within her. The threat from Henderson cast a long shadow over their small existence. He began a campaign of petty harassments. A section of Silas's fence would be mysteriously cut, his water trough fouled. Whispers circulated in the settlement, fueled by Henderson's insinuations, that Silas was unfit, that the child was neglected, that his claim to the meager water source on his land was dubious. Silas grew grimmer, lines of worry etched deeper around his eyes, but his resolve didn't waver. He repaired the fences, cleaned the trough, met the veiled accusations with stoic silence. Ilara watched it all, her own fear slowly being overlaid by a simmering anger. Henderson was a bully, and he was hurting Silas, the one person who had shown her a quiet, undemanding sanctuary. She began to explore Silas's land with a new purpose, her small, observant eyes taking in details Silas, in his preoccupation, might have missed. She knew the paths of the rabbits, the nesting places of the quail. She found a small seep, hidden amongst a tumble of rocks, that trickled even in the driest part of the day, not enough for irrigation, but precious drinking water. She showed it to Silas, tugging his hand and leading him there, her excitement a silent, vibrant thing. A rare, almost imperceptible softening touched Silas's lips. Good find, girl, but Henderson's pressure was relentless. One evening, the local marshal, a man named Tate who usually minded his own business but was clearly uncomfortable, rode out to the ranch. Henderson was with him, a smug look on his face. Silas, Tate began, clearing his throat. There's been a complaint. About the girl. And about your water usage. Henderson smirked. Says here, he produced a crinkled document, this land originally belonged to my great-uncle. He had prior water rights to that entire aquifer. You're stealing my water, Blackwood. And keeping a child in squalor. Silas stood straight, his face like granite. The child is cared for. The water is mine by homestead law. We'll see what a judge says, Henderson retorted. Unless you're willing to sell. Cheap. Considering your circumstances. He glanced pointedly at Ilara. That was when it happened. Ilara, who had been a silent shadow for so long, stepped forward. Her voice, when it came, was small, but clear and steady, cutting through the tense air. He's lying. All eyes turned to Ilara. Henderson scoffed. What would a waif like you know? Marshal Tate looked at her, a flicker of surprise, then interest, in his tired eyes. What do you mean, girl? Ilara swallowed, her gaze fixed on Henderson. She remembered the day he'd come to the cabin, his words. He said the South Spring. On his land. He said it was drying up. She looked at Silas. Our spring, it's small. But it always flows. His is drying up because he uses too much, or because it's a bad spring. She then pointed to the document Henderson held. My father, she stumbled over the word, the memory of the wagon a distant ache. He read papers. He said old papers sometimes aren't true anymore. New laws happen. It was a child's reasoning, simple, direct, yet it struck a chord. Silas looked at her, a profound, unspoken emotion in his eyes, pride, gratitude, astonishment. He'd given her shelter, and she, in turn, was offering him her voice, her courage. Marshal Tate looked from Henderson's reddening face to Silas's steadfast one, then to the small, determined girl. Mr. Henderson, Tate said slowly, this paper of yours, it's old. Been a lot of claims and counterclaims since then. Silas's homestead patent is current. As for the girl. He looked at Ilara, then at the tidy, if sparse, cabin. She seems well enough cared for to me. Better than some I've seen with kin of their own. Henderson sputtered, this is an outrage. That child doesn't know anything. She knows what she saw. And what she heard, Silas said, his voice quiet but firm, placing a hand on Ilara's shoulder. It wasn't just a protective gesture anymore, it was one of solidarity. And she knows this is her home. The word home hung in the air, imbued with a new weight, a shared truth. Henderson, seeing his leverage crumble, his bluster deflated by the unexpected testimony of a child and the marshal's sudden adherence to due process, scowled. This isn't over, Blackwood, but the threat sounded hollow now. He mounted his horse, shot one last venomous glare at Ilara, and rode off, Marshal Tate following after a moment, with a thoughtful, almost respectful nod toward Silas and the girl. The dust settled. Silence returned, but it was a different silence now, no longer filled with unspoken fears, but with a quiet, shared victory. The confrontation with Henderson didn't magically transform their lives into ease and plenty. The ranch was still a hard mistress, the winters still bit with a cruel tooth, and poverty remained a familiar shadow. But something fundamental had shifted. Ilara had found her voice, and in doing so, had cemented her place not just in the small cabin, but in Silas's guarded heart. He started talking to her more, not just issuing instructions, but sharing observations about the land, the animals, even, hesitantly, small fragments of his own past, a childhood on a greener farm, a wife lost to fever long ago. The grief was still there, a dull ache, but Ilara's presence seemed to make it bearable, a shared burden rather than a solitary torment. She, in turn, began to fill the silences with her own quiet observations, her questions, sometimes even a shy laugh that sounded like wind chimes in the stark landscape. She learned to read the clouds alongside him, to set snares, to tend the small garden with a fierce devotion, coaxing stubborn life from the unyielding soil. The wooden bird Silas had carved for her sat on the mantelpiece, a small, potent symbol of their unlikely bond. She started calling him Silas, not the man. He, in turn, sometimes called her Ellie, a softness in his rough voice that warmed her more than any fire. The people in the settlement noticed the change. They saw Silas walk a little taller, the harsh lines on his face eased somewhat. They saw Ilara, no longer a frightened shadow, but a child with a quiet confidence, her eyes clear and direct. Mrs. Miller from the store once pressed a small bag of sugar into Ilara's hand. "For you, child. You're a good help to Silas, I hear." It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. The community, once suspicious or indifferent, was slowly, cautiously, extending a hand. Henderson still grumbled, but his power was diminished. The story of the small girl who spoke truth to his bluster had circulated, tinged with a respect for her courage and Silas's steadfastness. They weren't just the poor rancher and the abandoned orphan anymore. They were Silas and Ilara, a family forged in hardship, bound by resilience and a quiet, profound affection. The seasons turned, etching their passage onto the land and into the lives of Silas and Ilara. The spring she had found, the one Henderson had coveted, became their small, reliable oasis. Ilara took to tending a tiny patch of wildflowers beside it, bright splashes of color against the muted tones of the prairie. It was her own small act of creation, a defiant affirmation of beauty in a harsh world. One day, a new wagon train passed, smaller and more ragged than the one that had left her behind. They stopped for water, their faces etched with weariness and uncertainty. A woman, her eyes hollow with worry, watched her own small daughter, no older than Ilara had been, playing listlessly in the dust. Ilara saw the reflection of her own past in the child's vacant stare. She approached cautiously, holding out the wooden bird Silas had carved for her. The little girl looked up, her eyes focusing slowly. Ilara pressed the bird into her small, dirty hand. "For luck," Ilara whispered, the words coming easily now. The mother looked at Ilara, then at Silas who stood watching from a distance, a rare, almost smile touching his lips. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Child Silas walked over, carrying a small sack. "Some dried meat. And a bit of flour. For the trail." The woman's eyes welled with tears. We can't pay her." Silas shook his head. "No need. Been there." He looked at Ilara, his gaze soft. "Just pass it on, when you can." As the wagon train prepared to leave, the little girl clutched the bird, a tiny spark of hope rekindled in her eyes. Ilara watched them go, not with the desolation she once felt, but with a quiet understanding. The trail was still a place of hardship, of endings, but it could also be a place of unexpected kindness, of new beginnings. She turned back to Silas, to their small, stubborn ranch that had become her whole world. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of gentle rose and deep violet. It was beautiful, and this time, the beauty didn't mock her. It welcomed her. She slipped her hand into Silas's rough, warm one. "Let's go home, Silas," she said. And he nodded, his heart, no longer shriveled, full. They walked towards the little cabin, two figures against the vast expanse, no longer alone, their shared silence now a comfortable embrace, their future an unwritten page filled not with riches, but with the enduring wealth of belonging. The dust of the trail still settled, but now, it felt like the dust of home.